Okay, good morning, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. Glad to be back with you, and those who are joining us online. I'm holding the camera up because I'm about to be on the move for just a moment. We've got a special announcement from Trish Willingham, I'm gonna take the camera to her. Okay, so hang on. Here we are, and wait a minute. Oh, there. Wait. Here. I need to be a better camera operator. Okay. Go ahead.
This just reminds me of doing it at home. I was never very good at it. Well, today in our tapestry, or perhaps you got it on email, they're talking about a mission that our church would like to be involved in. And I talked to Charlene Law about it, and I just think it's a really good mission for us to do. But the most exciting thing that I found out was how easy it was to do it. Because a lot of times they want all these things, and they still do, but we don't have to go shopping. And she sent this link. Okay, now we're hoping she's going to email it to us, and we hope that it'll work. This absolutely, you hit this little baby because I belong to Amazon Prime. It goes to my account with my addresses in it, and the address that it goes to is, what's her name?
Abby Adcock.
Abby Adcock. So she already has this set up in this app, and it goes straight to your own Amazon account. You just punch whatever you want to buy. You go down, it says where do you send it to, and it even has Abby Adcock's in there, which of course it says address hidden for security. It's so simple, and there's nothing to it.
And tell them what the cause is.
Oh, okay, yes, of course. Cause.
Oh, no.
Let me go
Spring
do this.
Valley Elementary.
Right, this is an elementary school in Spring Valley. It's a Title I school, and it has 420 students. 82% are economically disadvantaged. And the new assistant principal is our own Shauna Gaines. So there are a lot of things that they're desperately in need of. And you know, my sister was a second grade teacher for 40 years, and I said, talk to me about, because they asked for other things like you can send notes of encouragement. I said, what would you say? And she said, when you're teaching at a school with economically disadvantaged children, it is a mission. Okay, I thought that was priceless. So here you go, folks. It's so simple. Do it.
Bravo, bravo, bravo. Thank you, Trish, for calling us to action on that. Wonderful, wonderful. Let me get reset here. And hopefully all is well. Come on in, everyone. Okay, thanks to Chad for filling in for me last week. And we were, as you know, in Denver, where it was only slightly cooler than here, but at least a little bit. Right? They had a cool front come through one day, and it was in the mid 80s. That was pleasant. Yep. So all is well, and glad to be back with you, and my voice is back. I will say getting out of Texas helped my allergies tremendously. I need to do it more regularly, like get cleansed from all the crap in the air here.
If you do that, you have to go during the week. So you
during the week.
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Well, we are back to our new series on, I'm calling Bible Verses We Love, or something like that. And thanks, if you didn't turn in one, there's still some cards over here. Some of you emailed me. I've got a new card in. I mentioned before, y'all really like the Psalms. We got a lot of Psalms suggested. I discovered as I began to think about this, though, that if you're drawing a Venn diagram and looking at Bible verses we love and difficult passages of the Bible, there's a significant overlap between these two things. It's not total, but certainly some of our beloved passages are among the more difficult to deal with. And so I just want to, I'm going to get out of the gate today with a really difficult passage. And actually, there's two. We're going to dive into some parts of Romans chapter 8 today, where angels fear to tread. And I've got one section I'm going to talk about today, and another section I'm going to talk about next week. Next week we get to that part about we know that all things work together for good to those who love the Lord.
Which came up last week, so that's
Okay, good. It's a difficult passage, and it's set in, you got to understand the context of it. But before we get there today, we're going to get to an earlier part of this. It's a different thing, and these things end up being related. So how many of you, like me, were in a Baptist church or some other kind of church in the 70s where during worship you would stand up and greet everyone around you the way we used to do, right? And typically in that era, we would all sing together the Gaither song, "I'm so glad I'm a part of the family of God." Anyone remember this? "I'm so glad I'm a part of the family of God. I've been washed in the fountain, cleansed by his blood, joint heirs with Jesus as we travel this sod," because that rhymes with God. I'm right. Glad I'm a part of the family of God. Okay, y'all have not lived enough. Or clearly you didn't grow up in Oklahoma or North Texas. Right?
Right.
So this was a very popular little Gaither. I think the Blackwood brothers recorded it because there are verses to this. I didn't know that until I looked it up because all I ever heard was the chorus. Well, this little phrase about the family of God and joint heirs with Jesus is a common refrain in the New Testament in the writings of Paul. It appears in Romans, Galatians, Ephesians, and then I think it also is in one of the minor epistles as well. This idea is there over and over again. We'll get to the text in just a moment, but there's this theme that Paul uses repeatedly about us being adopted into the family of God. Well, this was very present in my mind on Friday when Allison and I went up to the Denton County Courthouse for the formal adoption ceremony of our next door neighbor kids. So y'all have heard me talk about our surrogate grandchildren next door, who are 9, 4, and 3 at this point. And then there's another almost 4-year-old and 1.5-year-old that were born into the family. So there's 5 kids. And have I mentioned that the parents are 28 years old?
How old?
28 years old. And they have 5 kids. Yeah, as they say, when they meet people and the people find out they have 5 kids, you can like watch people's brains trying to do the math. Like, how is that possible? Because they've only been married 6 years. And they have a 9-year-old. How many of y'all have ever been to a formal adoption ceremony at the courthouse? Anyone?
I've seen one.
Yeah.
Because I go to the court a lot.
Yeah. And
They're nice.
I'd never been to one. I'd heard about them.
Carolyn Murray said when Cameron Wilson was adopted was one of the most moving things she'd ever been a part of.
Nobody told me I needed to take a whole box of tissue with me.
Balloons and
I mean, the judge was crying. The attorneys were all crying. Everybody in the room was crying. I mean, it was the most moving thing I've seen in a long, long time. I had no idea at all. So here's what happened. You have the family arrayed, facing the judge in the courtroom, and friends and family have filled the rest of the seats in the courtroom. Family's over in the jury box, and extended family, and we're in the back and watching all this, and so the parents with all 5 kids, well, some of them running around as well, because this went on for an hour. I mean, it was a long. It felt like an hour. Maybe it was 45 minutes, but it was more than a few minutes. I thought, oh, this would be quick. No, it was not quick.
What does it take to fill up an hour
Oh, well, here's what I'm getting to. Because
on TV it takes 2 minutes.
yeah, well, no one told me there'd be speeches. And there were speeches and there were questions. So you had the attorneys up there, and the attorneys are recounting to the judge, who's already, a year ago in that same courtroom, there was a trial about custody that was a 2-week trial that was brutal. So we're back in the same courtroom, exactly 1 year to the day from when the jury trial was finished, that awarded custody to the adopted parents. And so this is all in the context of a lot of trauma, because these 3 kids have been through tremendous trauma in their young lives that brought them to this place where they are. And now they've got these loving parents, but who had to fight for them. And these 3 kids were physically abused. Physically abused. One of the young girls had a cut up inside her vagina. And they had to bring in last year a doctor to testify that this is not a naturally occurring thing.
Oh my God.
Because the other side tried to say, well, this just randomly happened. And this pediatrician came in and said, no, that does not randomly happen. You don't get cuts up there just randomly. And so this is the kind of thing that these kids have come out of. Drug abuse, all sorts of other problems. And they've really bloomed. And so here we are with all them arrayed, and the attorneys recount all this to the judge, because they've got to set, everything's in the record, right? And they're having to read into the record what's happened. And we're hearing all this. And then the attorneys have to ask each of the parents individually if they are making this choice to adopt these children on their own, if they understand what the consequences are. I mean, it's sobering. This was more serious than any wedding I've ever been to. I mean, the commitment that you're asked to make as an adopted parent is, do you understand? And are you willfully saying you will take these children and raise them as if they are your blood, and with the understanding that they have no one else to fall back on except you? That you are solely responsible for the welfare of these children. And the parents say, I do. I will. Yes, I understand. And I mean, it's just a sobering moment to understand. And then we get to the part where the attorney looks at each of them as she is questioning them and says, do you have any statement you would like to give? And that's when the written statements come out. And first the mother and then the father have prepared speeches that they're giving, reading into the record for their children, most of whom are too young to understand what's going on, but will someday be able to read the court record of this proceeding and know what was said about them, where the parents are declaring their love and care for these children. They are thanking everybody in the room for being part of the family that's made this possible. They are, everybody's weeping at this point. Everybody is weeping. And my favorite part about the whole thing is the 9-year-old who, it's 3rd grader, there was a whole row in front of us of her classmates from Moss Haven Elementary who were there watching this go, and they were paying rapt attention to this. Their mothers or fathers were with them, and these kids were watching their friend get adopted into this family and listening to every word. And it was absolutely, I can't even describe this, right? How absolutely moving this is. Yeah.
It reminds me that adoption is purposeful, intentional. Conception might be accidental, but adoption never is.
Boy, that is the gospel. Yeah, adoption is intentional and purposeful, even if conception is not. That is so true, right? And by the way, commercial, there are 11,000 children in the DFW Metroplex in need of foster parents today.
Wow.
11,000. And so this is a very, very important thing. We had a number of families in our church who've jumped into the foster system and have become adopted parents as well. And I just can't say enough praise to them for this. The difference it's going to make in a kid's life is phenomenal. So here's the passage from Romans chapter 8, beginning in verse 12. And I thought about this sitting in the courtroom on Friday. Paul writes, "So then, brothers, we are debtors, not to the flesh, not to live according to the flesh. For if we live according to the flesh, you're going to die. However, if we live by the Spirit, the deeds of the body putting to death, we will live. And many of you are led by the Spirit of God, who are the sons of God. For you have not received a spirit of bondage, again, to fear, but you have received the Spirit of divine adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. He himself, the Spirit, bears witness to, with the Spirit of us, that we are children of God. And if we are children, we are also heirs. Indeed, we are joint heirs of Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified together." Here's where this little phrase, joint heirs with Jesus, comes from. And you'll hear this, it's in songs, and you'll hear this a lot, this little phrase, joint heirs with Jesus. Well, what's interesting about this, to me, there's several things that are interesting about it. The first is, this is set in the context. Paul is writing to the Romans about faith in a time of persecution and how to live through this. And his encouragement to them is to say, you have been adopted into the household of faith and are joint heirs with Jesus in God's glorious riches. Well, what does that really mean? So, in the context of the Roman world, where these people lived in the first century, there was a well-established pattern of adoption. And our modern adoption law in the United States traces its roots to the Roman practice and law. The difference is, adoption was very popular among the upper classes in Rome in order to ensure succession. So the senators and the upper ruling class, if they didn't have a male heir, they would adopt someone to be their heir so that their line, their name, their money could continue. Their position could continue. And in a way, this helped build stability into the system, but it's also about ego at that point, right? I won't go into the details on this, but there's some interesting research on the Roman emperors. There's a whole succession of them who had adopted children who followed them as Caesar, all the way from Augustus to Nero. Adoption. It is really fascinating. If you're interested in that bit of history, go look it up. Many of the Caesars were adopted into their position. They became Caesar, they became ruler because they were adopted. So here's the context in which Paul is speaking to the early Christians to talk about this.
Yet isn't it funny that in the Bible over the years you always learn about the scarlet thread, how it follows through person to person to person, and how they trace it back to like Adam,
Right.
And how Jesus came from that lineage, and they're very careful to spell it out that he wasn't adopted or
Right.
in a mixed ethnicity, that he's pure Jewish and pure Abrahamic.
Right.
and
Yeah,
all.
no, you're right,
And
Jim.
it's like it's contradictory that it's so important that he came from this bloodline,
Right.
and yet being adopted is good.
Right. Here's the second part of this. when Paul's talking about Gentiles, that's us, being adopted into the family of God, it is a parallel to what the Old Testament has already talked about happening to the Jewish people. So think about this for a moment, and here's where a lot of Christianity goes astray. I'm going to try to make my case here. When God speaks to Abram, it is in a sense an adoption of Abram and his family into a status. It is not that Abram was born into special status. As an adult, God called Abram into relationship. And from there, God said he would create a great and mighty nation. That is, in a sense, an adoption. It is not a birthright that Abram had. It's because God chose to use Abram. And what we see Paul saying in the New Testament is that God has chosen to adopt Gentiles into the family of faith as well. There's other places where Paul talks about us being grafted into the tree, Gentiles being grafted into the tree of Israel. And why the reason I'm going through all this detail on this is to make the case that the Christian church has not replaced Israel. There is a heresy that is widespread in the church. Supersessionism is what it's called, to be technical. And this is the idea that the Christian church has replaced Israel in God's favor, which allows you to be mean in your behavior to Jewish people, right? It allows you to discriminate because God's left them behind. That's not what Paul says at all. By the way, Paul's Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. That didn't go away, right? What Paul is saying is that just as the Jewish people, the children of Israel, were adopted into the family of God, so Gentiles through Jesus are adopted into the family of God, and we are joint heirs with Jesus. This is like the phrase joint heirs is like if you have an estate, and let's say that you have a sibling and you are co-heirs in that estate. A parent dies and they leave the estate to both of you together. This is the way our will is set up. We have two boys, and whatever we leave behind when we're both gone, it goes to them equally. They are joint heirs together. This is a remarkable thing if you think about it, because Jesus, we are told, as the Son of God, is entitled to tremendous riches and glory, and we, Paul says, are joint heirs to that. That's mind-boggling, right? That's better than winning the lottery. Whoever won that lottery, yeah, right? Let me pause and let me hear your questions or comments about this. Anyone? I just left you speechless again.
A little peculiarity about Texas law on adoption: you can legally disinherit your natural children. You cannot legally disinherit your adopted children.
Or and I asked an adopted parent that question because I'd heard the same thing, and they said that's not true.
Oh, really?
Yes, because I'd heard the same thing.
Well, a judge in West Texas said it is. So
This was a percentage of an adopted.
There may be a different law in West Texas.
Yeah. I liked that, but then when I questioned it, I was
Interesting.
told.
Oh.
What else?
Maybe they don't know it.
What else?
There's so many phrases in there that I don't understand why they throw in there. Like, well, talking about living by the flesh or not by the flesh, we are debtors.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, why are you throwing that in there in the middle of how you should live?
Thank you for asking. That's where I'm going next. That's a perfect setup. I'll pay you later for that. If you back up to verse 12, And I'm reading from a Greek English interlinear translation, so what I tell you may be a little broken compared to what you're reading that's more smooth, right? So then we are debtors, not to the flesh, if we live according to the flesh, right? So this phrase debtors is exactly what it sounds like. It is a word that means to be indebted to someone, to be obligated to someone. We are debtors. We owe a debt of gratitude. We owe a debt of responsibility to God who has saved us from the flesh. And the flesh here is, now, in a good Christian church, we love to talk about the flesh being carnal desires and sexuality. We love to talk about sexuality. If you've been to any church youth group, it's always about sex, right? This word flesh is not really about that in the same way. This particular word flesh is about selfishness. Now that can involve all sorts of things, right? So I'm not excluding carnality from that, but it's more than that. And this is the problem with a lot of interpretation, and a lot of what happens in the church is we fixate on sexuality to the point that we forget that there are other things that are equally bad that are all driven by selfishness, right? So you can be sexually pure and still be a sorry son of a bitch, right? And I mean that in the most theological way possible. Yes.
Okay, getting back to being adopted.
Yeah.
You know, into the, through Jesus, into the Christian, you know,
Right.
believing. Are you basically saying that because the Jews don't believe in the New Testament, that they are not subject to the same, where we have to say believe on the Lord is the only way we can
Okay.
see that?
Great question. So for those at home, Marilyn's asking, am I saying that because God has adopted the children of Israel and then adopted Gentiles, does that mean I'm saying that Jewish people do not have to believe on Jesus? And my answer to your question is, I don't know.
Okay.
I think you could make a good case for that, but the reality is we don't know. Here's the evidence different ways. Number one, the early Christians were almost all Jews who believed in Jesus and followed Jesus. So there's a pattern of that. Paul and all the disciples were Jews, right? Very interesting pattern there. The Gentiles came along, right? So it's not that it can't happen. What you're asking is, does it have to happen? Must Jewish people believe on Jesus in order to be? And so then you have the words of Jesus, no one comes to the Father except through me, right? But you also have the original promise of God to the children of Israel that they will be his people. And so this idea of supersessionism says, well, they abdicated that responsibility, right? They didn't do what God said, so therefore they broke the covenant that God made with them. Well, that's sort of hard for us to say, right? That's very hard for us from our perspective to say. So the way I generally answer this question, and I'm open to anyone else who wants to weigh in on this, is I'm not God. It's not up to me to decide who's in and who's out. There's another passage in the New Testament that says all the Jewish people in time will be saved. And this is a great conundrum for end times prophecy people, right? And they have to envision some mass conversion event later on. The reality is, I don't know.
I watched the better part of a movie the other night, and I don't remember the name of
What
it.
about the lesser part of the movie? Did you not finish it?
I got bored with it after
Okay.
a while. But it was based on a true story about a minister in Tulsa who he'd gone to ORU,
Yeah.
was basically adopted by Oral Roberts as his
I'm struggling to remember his name.
son, well, it's Chadwick Boseman in the movie.
Yeah, anyone?
Was it Carlson Pearson?
Say again?
Carlson Pearson?
Yes, Carlton Pearson. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Watching news footage of the Rwandan genocide, you know, horrible pictures of children starving to death, 3/4 dead, all the
Right.
bad stuff from Rwanda. And he just could not believe that God was sending all those people to hell. In other words, he began to interpret Jesus's message as basically everybody is
Yeah,
saved.
and he became a universalist
Yeah.
and paid a horrible price for it. I mean,
Yeah.
he lost everything. He got shunned from that evangelical world
Well,
and
the
the
world
Pentecostal
dropped
world.
him pretty fast, I know that.
Yeah, no, he was on TV. He was everywhere. It's a fascinating story, indeed. And
Well, and you have to think about all the people who lived before the time of Christ, thousands and thousands of years ago.
yeah, then you have the question of people who lived before the time of Christ. How do you deal with them, right? So here, one of the reasons I like this adoption language and the joint heirs language is it's not dependent upon our action. God has adopted us into the family of faith. Yes, adopted children, if they're old enough, have to agree to assent to the adoption. At our event on Friday, the two youngers are too young to make a conscious decision, but the 9-year-old, the attorney looked at her and said, "Do you want to be adopted into this family?" And she said, "Yes." Yes, she does. Now, I'm not sure that would have stopped the deal, but but the point of adoption is the primary legal action takes part by the adoptive parent, right? And in this case, God has chosen us. God has chosen us. Now, the way Paul writes this is those who live according to the Spirit and not according to the flesh.
You say God has chosen us. That almost sounds like predestination.
Oh, thank you for asking that great question. That's your second setup for today. Very good. And Jim says that sounds like predestination. Here's the problem with Romans 8 in general. It is very easy to read the entirety of Romans 8. We're just reading a brief section today and make a case for predestination, right? In some other verses that are there that I'm not getting into today. It's very easy to make that case. Here's where I come down. Yes, God has predestined to save you, just as God is predestined to save everyone else God has created. It's not just a select group of people. Yes.
If God has chosen us, don't we have to choose him back?
Well, the reality is you can reject God's invitation.
Yeah.
You can reject it because we do believe in free will. But in my view, you've got to willfully reject God. Willfully reject God. What else about this adoption language?
What about the many who have never heard the gospel?
Yeah. That's back to the other. What about the many who've never heard the gospel? And back to this point from the Carlton Pearson documentary, is God so cruel as to keep them from hearing? I don't think so. That's no God worth wanting to be a part of, in my view. Now there are those out there who make a strong case, and they're fervent in their belief that this is it's all God's will, and so who are we to question any of this? But that's not what I think love
No,
is.
I don't think so, but my dad always thought that even through nature itself that people could find God. Now, I don't agree with that necessarily, but he felt that the reason people didn't get saved was because people were called to the mission field and they didn't go. So in other words, it falls back on us as God's children.
So we're running close on time. I want to wrap up by saying that sometimes the experiences we think are for other people are actually to educate and change us. So we can become so fixated on what God is doing or not doing with other people in the world that we don't pay attention to ourselves and our own relationships. I have a friend in our neighborhood whose husband is on hospice and actively dying, probably will not make it through the week. They are, and I was over visiting their house last night, and they are Episcopalian. It's two men who've been married for 33 years. And in talking to my friend, whose husband is dying, their Episcopal priest had been over, and my friend had said to her, "Why is my husband going through this? Why is he suffering in this way? Why is this so difficult?" And the priest gave an answer that, dear God, I wish I'd thought of 20 years ago. I'm going to remember this one. Because what she said to him was, the lessons to be learned in this are not for him. They are for you. They are for you. Because you will live life differently having come face to face with the reality of death. It will change you. I thought, wow, that's amazing, right? When we come face to face with the reality of death in other people, which most of us want to avoid thinking about, right? It has the power to make us think more accurately about living. And when we understand how God has chosen to love us and adopt us into the family of faith, we can stop worrying about other people. It's not that we don't care, right? But they cannot be our obsession. We need to be thankful for the gift that God has given. And to further answer the question, we are responsible for the knowledge we have at this moment. We're responsible to respond to the invitation that we know and that we have for salvation. And God deals with other people according to the way God will. And again, I'm not God in that. Is that helpful at all?
Mark, what about somewhere in all of this, there's general and special revelation.
Yeah.
And how would you define general revelation?
So the general revelation, this is back to what Carol Ann's talking about, because Scripture does say that creation itself declares the glory of God, right? This is in the Psalms. And I do believe that we have examples of people who have found faith simply through the witness of creation and believed somehow, right? So there is this general knowledge of God that's within the world. But then, to oversimplify everything, there are more specific revelations we have along the way that sometimes we have to be looking for to see. Because there's a lot of God's glory around us that we are not attuned to pay attention to. We're not looking, right? And this is how our senses are dulled sometimes, because we're preoccupied with other things. It's just amazing the way when you look for something, you see it more often than before. And when you're looking for God's work in the world and God's redemptive love, you're going to see other examples of God's work in the world, right? That's a very simplified, very, very simplified answer to this question. Okay, there's so much more we can say about this. The last thing I want to say about this is this in verse 15. Because of this adoption, we're able to cry out, Abba, Father. And this is the relationship of the adopted child. God is now our parent, and we can cry out and find help and relief from our parent because of the Spirit of God within us. We are joint heirs with Jesus in this. Well, this was yeah.
I've been terrible. I've been so engrossed in your lesson, I haven't looked at this.
Okay.
All right, so here's Kristen Cabanis. There was a play that was at DTC a few years ago, and I have no clue when she said that.
Okay.
Apologize. And then Ellen Minning, the phrase can only get to the Father through, it's so hard to read the white.
Through Jesus, yeah.
Through me.
Yeah.
Might mean that Jesus died for all humanity. Therefore, it was through,
So we're on to the views of the atonement. Was the death of Christ on the cross sufficient for all salvation, or only for certain? So general atonement versus specific atonement, limited atonement. Yeah.
and that's it. I'll do better, maybe.
Oh, no worries. No worries. So as difficult as some of this passage is, this is nothing compared to where we're going next week. If you want to read ahead, we're going to pick up in chapter 8, Romans chapter 8, verse 18. The present sufferings are nothing compared to the future glory. And we're going to get all the way down into that passage about all things work together for good, which I know sounds like a pile of baloney most of the time. And we're going to come to grips with that. I mean, that passage, all things work together for good, it would be in the top 10 most misused passage of scripture I know. Most inappropriately quoted. Most often used for comfort when it does not comfort, right? And so this is the complete intersection of difficult passages of the Bible with beloved passages of the Bible. It's just exhibit A.
Can we find that elsewhere or just Paul?
All things work together for good?
Yeah.
It's only in this one passage.
Right. Great Paul, don't you just love it?
You gotta love Paul. Well, I mean, you can find echoes of it in other places. Very interesting. All right. I feel like I've talked a lot today on this, but at least I had a voice to talk, so I'm thankful for that. Right. Let's pray together for those who are online.
To remind them too, in 3 weeks, we back it up to 9:45.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
9:45 in 3 weeks.
I sure have loved this 10 o'clock start.
Yeah.
Oh. You know, the problem is there's some classes that have been starting at 9:45 because they want to get in all their time.
Yeah.
And
Not us.
you can see how I feel about this.
We're quality, not quantity.
That's right. We can get a lot done in 30 minutes. Or 40, most of the time. Let's pray together. Grant us your grace now, Lord, and help us to understand the tremendous gift that you've given us through your adoption of us into your family of faith. Thank you. I pray your blessings upon each one today, those who are struggling, those who need direction, those who need healing, those who need encouragement. Pour out your Spirit upon each, we pray, and guide us in your way. Through Jesus Christ. Amen.